which are of course the dominant, but then also these small moments that are impactful and positive. Nwoye's story needs to be told, and he's not even Okonkwo, he's just Okonkwo's son. Often Achebe is accused, I think that may be the word, accused of not having told the story of anything other than a great man, like Okonkwo. And yet I think there are places, we already paused for a second over Chielo, that the ultimate source of meaning and justice in the community is actually a woman who's got the status of being a kind of prophet. But when we get to chapter 9, the story pauses for Okonkwo, and instead we hear about his wife and about one of the children in his household. So Okonkwo, he's not in the picture just at the moment. And we have a child, an ill child, Ezinma, and her mother. And Ezinma is uneasy with her adopted mother, doesn't really know what to make of her. And even calls her mother by her given name, not by her family name. But it's actually not so much the portrait of Ezinma, the daughter, as it is the portrait of Ekwefi, the mother, that I want us to pause over. So here's the text that I think is so striking. And I want just to mention for a moment, have you ever thought, maybe you have, but if you have, please remind yourself. If you haven't, I invite you to do so. Have you ever thought about whether your name means anything? Actually, most names do mean something, although we sometimes don't think about that. So my name, for example, is in a number of languages. Elizabeth, it's a Hebrew name. Elishavat, my God is my Sabbath. My middle name is an odd one, a kind of antique name, Merle, of all things, which is actually a feminine form of Merlin, the same word that the wizard has, and also a type of little black magical bird. Richmond, is Anglo-Norman. It's an old French name, and it means born in a high place. And the last term, Garza, if you know loteria or you just know the wildlife around Texas, is an egret, stork, a type of water bird. So my name has meaning, but it's probably kind of incidental. Ekwefi does a lot more with naming. She makes naming impactful. She tries to name her children to make them strong, despite the fact she knows that they will, in all likelihood, pass away before they even become 2 years old. So here's the moment that Achebe pauses over the challenge of being female. It's a very traditional section because it's about a woman as a mother. And that may or may not be the way that you define gender in terms of those who identify as female. But this is how Achebe is going to phrase things. Ekwefi, we're told, had suffered a good deal in her life. She'd borne 10 children, and 9 of them had died in infancy, usually before the age of 3. As she buried one child after another, her sorrow gave way to despair and then to grim resignation. The birth of her children, which should be a woman's crowning glory, became for Ekwefi a mere physical agony devoid of promise. The naming ceremony, after 7 market weeks, became an empty ritual. Her deepening despair found expression in the names she gave her children. So here's how she attends to the fact that the world is simply going to give her the greatest and most unbearable sorrow that she, at least, in terms of her values, can experience. So here are the names. One of them was a pathetic cry, Unwombiko, death, I implore you. But death took no notice. Unwombiko died in his 15th month. The next child was a girl, Ozomina. May it not happen again. She died in her 11th month, and 2 others after her. Ekwefi then became defiant and called her next child Onwuma. Death may please himself, and he did. In the midst of her misery and loss, in this unbearable position, of all the things that she could do, and you might contrast this to Okonkwo, what's important to Ekwefi is to use language, to use words, to try to give strength to someone based upon how you call them and what name you give them. Consistently, whether in Chielo's prophecy, in Ekwefi's naming, or in the story she's about to tell, women are connected to words, to using language as a way of rescuing people, supporting people, trying to give them strength in the face of nearly unbearable odds. In chapter 11, we get the really beautiful scene of the village falling asleep. Everyone's in their particular house, in their particular setting, and it's especially the mothers and children that we hear about. And there's a turn-taking, kind of like a collective Shahrazad. Each mother tells a story, not just only to her children, but to all the children. And this night, this not moonlit night, this dark night, it falls on Achebe to take a turn. And at the bottom of 2980, she begins to tell us the story of the tortoise. Once upon a time, so like all the military officers sitting around in St. Petersburg, in Pushkin's text perhaps as well. Once upon a time, she began, all the birds were invited to a feast in the sky. They were very happy and began to prepare themselves for the great day. They painted bodies with red camwood and drew beautiful patterns on them all. So an imagined party, and of course the trick is the tortoise talks his way in, the tortoise uses a turn of phrase that means he's going to get all the food, but then everyone, including his own wife, dislikes him so much that when he needs to fall and needs to leave the bird's location, nobody's willing to put a pillow down to catch his fall, hence the tortoise having a cracked shell. So it's a kind of fairy tale, it's a kind of fable with animals that talk, very much in the style of Shahrazad, and it teaches a lesson. Greed will not be recorded. You will get your comeuppance, as we hear in 2982, around the middle of the page. That's why the tortoise shell is not smooth. Rather than using violence or other sorts of approaches, Achebe, in order to make her point, simply tells a brilliant story about behaving well. Unfortunately, unlike her husband is never as skillful at doing something productive and doing something negotiated. In the midst of a festival, just by a few pages later, on 2994, Okonkwo has a gun, and accidentally the gun fires. This is the second time that a gun has accidentally fired, or that an unloaded gun has caused someone's death. So Okonkwo becomes guilty in the midst of this public ritual, becomes guilty of having inadvertently killed someone. And we're told in the middle of 2994, quote, "The only course open to Okonkwo was to flee from the clan. It was a crime against the earth goddess to kill a clansman, and a man who committed it must flee from the land. The crime was of two kinds, male and female. Okonkwo had committed the female because it had been inadvertent. He could not return to the clan after 7 years." So actually there's a whole lot there that I think is really, really interesting. So we have this accident in the middle of the public performance, this public ritual moment, and it's an accident. And we're told there are two types of crime, again, very gender binary, and you may or may not be comfortable with this, very traditional views of gender. But according to those traditional views of gender, the less terrible crime, so manslaughter rather than murder, accidental killing rather than intentional killing, is the one that's considered female. And just as Montaigne invited us to see that actually these non-European communities very much have systems of justice, so too Achebe says, actually, traditional Nigerian justice cares about intent. Did Okonkwo mean to do the harm he did? No, he did not. Therefore, his penalty is very much adjusted to what he did and did not intend to do. He has to go into exile. He has to leave, but he will be allowed to return within 7 years. Achebe is giving us a portrait of pre-colonial justice and pre-colonial culture, and perhaps inviting us to reflect on whatever culture we identify with, and whether it's as sophisticated, as nuanced, as thoughtful, as the way that the clan here decides, yes, you did something terrible and you must be punished. But if you serve your time in exile, you may be invited back. So Okonkwo is going to go into exile. He's going to have to leave the village, and where he has to go is to the village where his mother is from. He'd been living in the village of his father, and he now has to return to the village of his mother. And rather than me reading more of Achebe, I wanted to give you just another moment in which you get to hear Achebe reading for himself. And so it's that same lovely evening that he did at the Library of Congress. I just want to share for a moment with you the way that Achebe speaks. So let me just get the sound hooked up here for you. so that you can hear him and once again get a lovely sense of how understated and modest he is in the way that he expresses himself. So here's that same piece, and let me just have you listen to him for a moment.
Okonkwo and his family I begin again. Okonkwo and his family worked very hard to plant a new farm. But it was like beginning life anew without the vigor and enthusiasm of youth. Like learning to become left-handed in old age. Work no longer had for him the pleasure it used to have. And when there was no work to do, he sat in a silent half-sleep. His life had been ruled by a great passion to become one of the lords of the clan. That had been his life spring, and he had all but achieved it. Then everything had been broken.
Well, I encourage you very much to take the opportunity, if you can, actually to listen to all of that evening with Achebe. But I wanted you just to have another moment of him reading. And another one of my favorites, very much a proverb. We have a number of these here in the Nigerian tradition. My favorite moments, where he asks you to think about what is it like to be in an environment where you don't fit in, where things do not make sense. And he says it's like a right-handed person trying to be left-handed, or nowadays we might say, or a left-handed person trying to be right-handed. It's that awkward. So his mother's family realized that something is really wrong in Okonkwo's world, that he's depressed, that he's unhappy. And they try to cheer him up. But they treat him a little bit like a schoolboy. They ask him to explain a famous Nigerian saying, why do we say mother is supreme? And they kind of scold him because he doesn't know the answer. But it gets to that question of what is the role of women, of the female part of the culture in traditional Nigerian worldview. So he doesn't answer the question very well. So finally, one of the male older family members of his mother says, look, okay, I'm going to explain to you. Listen to me, he says, at the bottom of 2997. It is true that a child belongs to its father, but when a father beats his child, it seeks sympathy with its mother first, in its mother's heart. A man belongs to his fatherland when things are good and life is sweet. But when there is sorrow and bitterness, he finds refuge in his motherland. Your mother is there to protect you. She's buried there. And that is why we say that mother is supreme. Is it right to you, Okonkwo, should bring to your mother a heavy face and refuse to be comforted? And he'll go on to explain that although men and the masculine has power in the culture, when things are really difficult, when you've been harmed, it's actually your mother. It's the women who offer resilience, and it's they who offer real support. So it's not quite clear whether his mother's family members get through to him, but Okonkwo does serve his 7 years in exile, 7 hard years. And at the bottom of 3012, we are reminded explicitly how hard it would be to be wandering, to be like the sage that wants a refuge, a safe place with Shakuntala to spend the night. So at the beginning of chapter 20, at the bottom of 3012,